The Venezuela invasion. How the U.S. just killed the petrodollar to save it. January 3rd, 2026. It was 3:47 in the morning in Caracas, Venezuela. The streets were dark, the city was sleeping, and most of the world had absolutely no idea what was coming. By sunrise, the sitting president of a sovereign nation was in handcuffs aboard a U.S. military transport aircraft. The world woke up to a headline that felt impossible. The United States had walked into a foreign country and removed its leader by force. They called it a law enforcement operation. They said it was about narco-terrorism, drug cartels, and cocaine moving through the Western Hemisphere. But here is what no press conference, no official statement, and no presidential podium ever said out loud. This was not about drugs. This was about a ledger. A financial ledger 50 years deep, denominated in trillions of dollars, that the United States could not afford to let a single nation close. We think this story is about politics. We think it is about imperialism, Latin American sovereignty, and the battle between left-wing governments and Washington's influence. That is the surface narrative. The real story lives underneath it, buried in oil invoices, debt contracts, and currency agreements. It is about what happens when a country stops accepting your money and starts conducting business in someone else's. It is about the petrodollar. And on January 3rd, 2026, the United States did something that defies all logic. It destroyed its own monetary architecture, trying desperately to save it. Cast your mind back to 1973. Venezuela was not a struggling nation. It was not a cautionary tale. It was a powerhouse sitting on 303 billion barrels of crude oil, the largest proven reserves anywhere on Earth. OPEC had just delivered its historic oil embargo, and the world was learning in real time how much raw financial power lived inside a single oil field. Venezuela was at the table. Venezuela was essential. Caracas, the capital, looked like a city that had won. The skyline climbed higher every year. New highways, gleaming hotels, fresh construction rising on every boulevard. Petrodollars flowed so freely that Venezuela's elite flew to Miami on weekend shopping trips the way ordinary Americans drove to a grocery store. The middle class was expanding. The currency held firm. The oil revenue seemed like it would never stop arriving. The country felt like the future. But beneath that golden surface, embedded inside every oil contract and every trade arrangement, something dangerous had already taken root. Venezuela had made a deal. It was never signed. It was never voted on by the Venezuelan people. But it was absolutely binding. You price your oil in U.S. dollars. You hold your reserves in U.S. dollars. You recycle those dollars back into U.S. Treasury bonds. In return, you receive access to American markets, American military protection, and the favor of the world's most powerful economy. It was not a contract. It was a chain. And for 25 years, nobody felt the weight of it. Then 1999 arrived, and so did Hugo Chavez. He walked into the presidential palace not as a diplomat, but as a detonator. He was a former military officer, a man who had survived a failed coup of his own making, and he came to power with one question burning inside him that no Venezuelan president before him had ever dared to ask publicly. Why are we selling the world's largest oil reserve exclusively for American paper? Why does someone else's currency sit at the center of our nation's entire wealth? The petrodollar system had no good answer. That silence was the beginning of the end. Chavez began dismantling the arrangement piece by piece, methodically and without apology. In 2000, he flew to Baghdad and shook hands with Saddam Hussein on live television, announcing oil for goods barter arrangements that bypassed the dollar entirely. In 2001, he rewrote Venezuela's hydrocarbons law, forcing ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips out of majority ownership in Venezuelan oil operations. American corporations that had extracted profits from Venezuelan soil for decades were told to accept minority stakes or leave the country. Most of them left. But here is the real villain of this story. Not Chavez, not Washington, not even the oil companies. The real antagonist is the petrodollar system itself, a creature born in 1973 from a quiet backroom arrangement between the Nixon administration and the Saudi royal family. America would protect the Saudi monarchy with its military. Saudi Arabia would price all oil exclusively in U.S. dollars and convince the rest of OPEC to do the same. That single agreement meant that every nation on earth needing oil had to first acquire dollars. The dollar became oxygen. America became the source. That is what Venezuela was threatening to suffocate. By 2005, Chavez had locked in a $60 billion oil for loans deal with China. Venezuela would ship crude. China would deliver infrastructure investment. Not a single U.S. dollar moved through a single American bank. This was not a transaction. It was a declaration of financial independence. By 2006, subsidized Venezuelan oil was flowing to Cuba in exchange for Cuban doctors and teachers deployed across Venezuela. No dollars, no banks, pure barter. The balance sheet was being deliberately rewritten in currencies Washington had no access to. In 2007, Venezuela formally exited both the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Chavez paid off every last dollar Venezuela owed to both institutions and announced their departure on national television. He was not merely paying a debt. He was severing a leash. The creditors were dismissed. The account was cleared, and Washington watched with growing dread as the realization crystallized. This was not political theater. Chavez was constructing an alternative financial architecture, brick by brick, barrel by barrel. By 2008, Venezuela was standing at the United Nations calling openly for a new global reserve currency to replace the dollar. Chavez proposed a South American currency called the sucre. He was forging financial and diplomatic alliances with Iran, Russia, and China, all nations nursing deep grievances against dollar dominance. Think carefully about what this means. The country with the world's largest oil reserves was actively building a coalition to replace the monetary system that kept America on top. This was not idealism. This was a financial insurgency, and Washington was losing it. The U.S. responded the only way it knew how, through coercion. In 2002, CIA-connected coup plotters removed Chavez from power for 48 hours before he was restored by massive popular support. The coup failed. In 2004, UC-funded opposition groups ran a recall referendum. Chavez won it with 59% of the vote. The covert operations were failing. The propaganda was failing. So the United States reached for the one weapon it had sharpened more carefully than any other: the financial system itself. In 2015, President Obama signed an executive order formally declaring Venezuela a national security threat. Sanctions began. And then in 2017, the Trump administration opened the full arsenal and fired everything at once. American companies were banned overnight from buying Venezuelan oil. 500,000 barrels per day gone. That was $13.7 billion per year in revenue, erased by a presidential signature. Venezuelan government assets held inside U.S. banks, approximately $7 billion, were frozen with no appeal, no recourse, and no timeline for release. The most devastating blow was almost invisible to the outside world. The U.S. banned the sale of spare parts, machinery, and specialized equipment to Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, and this is where the trap reveals its true architecture. Venezuela's entire oil infrastructure had been built with American technology. The refineries, the drilling rigs, the pressure pumps, all of it required American components to function. When those components stopped arriving, the machinery began to die on its feet. By 2020, Venezuelan oil production had collapsed from 2.4 million barrels per day down to 500,000, an 80% obliteration. Annual oil revenue fell from $56 billion to $11 billion. The economy did not slow down. It incinerated itself. Now here is the smoking gun, and it does not look like a weapon at all. It looks like a contract. On December 28, 2025, just 6 days before the invasion, China and Venezuela signed an $80 billion infrastructure agreement. China would rebuild Venezuela's entire oil production capacity from the ground up. New refineries, new pipelines, new deep-water port terminals. Venezuela would supply 1.2 million barrels of oil per day to China for 5 years in exchange, every single barrel priced in Chinese yuan. $0, not 1 cent of American currency anywhere in the arrangement. Let that number sink in. 1.2 million barrels per day, priced in yuan, from the nation holding the world's largest oil reserves, locked contractually to the world's second-largest economy for half a decade. This was not a trade agreement. This was a foreclosure notice. The U.S. government received that contract and immediately understood its true meaning. If China physically rebuilds Venezuela's oil infrastructure, if Chinese engineers pour the concrete and lay the pipe, the dollar is not just excluded from that deal. It is excluded permanently. Not for 5 years, for 50. The meeting that truly mattered was not held in Caracas or Beijing. It was held inside the National Security Council in Washington, where the numbers on the table told a story of terminal financial exposure. Venezuela's 303 billion barrels locked in yuan. Russia's 5 million barrels per day already trading outside the dollar. Iran's 1.5 million daily barrels flowing in yuan and euros. By late 2025, 15% of all global oil trade was occurring in non-dollar currencies, representing $410 billion in annual transactions leaving the system. Projections showed this reaching 25 to 30% by 2028. The petrodollar was not loosening its grip. It was losing its hands entirely. The decision was made. Venezuela had to be recaptured by force. And so on January 3, 2026, the helicopters came. U.S. Special Operations Forces landed simultaneously at multiple locations across Caracas. The operation ran under Title 10 military authority, an acknowledged military mission, not a secret CIA action. Nicolás Maduro was captured at the presidential palace before the city was fully awake. He was loaded onto a military transport and flown directly to a U.S. federal detention facility on American soil. A 2020 federal drug trafficking indictment was the legal wrapper stretched over what every international lawyer on earth recognized immediately as an act of war. Within 24 hours, the United States recognized Juan Guaidó as a legitimate president of Venezuela. He was flown back to Caracas on January 4th aboard a U.S. military aircraft, installed like a replacement part in a broken machine. Within 48 hours, the new acting government announced that all future Venezuelan oil contracts would be denominated in U.S. dollars. The China deal was suspended pending review. PDVSA would immediately resume sales to American refineries. Venezuela had been physically repossessed and dragged back into the petrodollar system at gunpoint. Sovereignty is solvency. When a nation loses one, it surrenders both simultaneously. Here's where the plan collapsed completely. Not in the streets of Caracas. On the trading floors of Shanghai, Moscow, and Riyadh, the U.S. government had calculated that a show of raw power would frighten other oil-producing nations into compliance. That revealing the consequences of leaving the dollar would discourage anyone from trying. The calculation was catastrophically wrong, because what the invasion showed the world was not American strength. It revealed American desperation. It demonstrated that the petrodollar system could no longer sustain itself through economic merit. It now required military enforcement to breathe. In the 72 hours following the invasion, oil prices spiked from $74 per barrel on January 2nd to $89 per barrel on January 5th, a 20% increase in 3 days. Every oil-exporting government on earth recalculated its risk in real time. The yuan strengthened 1.8% against the dollar within 48 hours, not because China acted, but because global investors were moving money toward a currency that did not arrive on military helicopters. Russia's finance minister stated publicly, "Venezuela has shown us what happens when you depend on the dollar. We will not make that mistake." Saudi Arabia postponed renewal talks on its U.S. defense commitments. The kingdom that had kept the petrodollar alive since 1973 was now accelerating private conversations with Beijing about accepting yuan for 20% of Chinese oil purchases. OPEC issued a formal statement expressing grave concern about the use of military force in disputes related to energy sovereignty. 14 nations signed a joint declaration demanding the creation of an international payment system independent of the U.S. dollar. The signatories included China, Russia, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, Turkey, and 7 others. The gold was draining. The credit was fracturing. The Allies were calculating their exits. The United States invaded Venezuela to protect the petrodollar, and the invasion became the single greatest accelerant to the petrodollar's collapse in the system's entire history. It exposed the protection racket for what it had always been, and protection rackets only function when the enforcer remains credible. The moment you reveal that enforcement is all you have left, the racket begins to die. Countries do not want membership in a currency system that comes with a military occupation clause, written in the fine print. The descent moves quickly from this point. Through the first quarter of 2026, oil settles near $95 per barrel, and U.S. gas climbs to $4.20 per gallon. Nations stay quiet publicly, but accelerate their exit plans in private. By mid-year, Saudi Arabia announces it will accept yuan for 15% of Chinese oil purchases, Oil hits $115 per barrel. The dollar falls 4% against major currencies in a single week. The petrodollar system's founding architecture begins to visibly crack for the first time in 5 decades. By the fourth quarter of 2026, Nigeria, Angola, and Kazakhstan announced partial yuan acceptance. The BRICS bloc unveils a new reserve currency backed by a commodity basket of oil, gold, and rare earth minerals. The dollar's share of global reserves falls below 50% for the first time since World War II. U.S. inflation reaches 11%. Gas hits $7 per gallon. Groceries rise 40% because every calorie in the food supply chain runs on diesel, and diesel now costs more than at any point in recorded history. The Federal Reserve cannot raise rates enough to defend the dollar without making the government's $36 trillion in existing debt impossible to service. The trap has fully closed, not on Venezuela. On America, the American people will carry this wound for a generation. They did not order the invasion. Most of them had never heard the word petrodollar spoken in any classroom, any newscast, or any presidential debate. But they will pay the full invoice. Their retirement accounts will lose a quarter of their real purchasing value as the dollar erodes faster than markets can compensate. Their wages will buy less every month while the bills climb higher every season. The standard of living built on 50 years of artificially cheap imports, enabled entirely by global dollar demand, will compress inward like a crushed lung. This is not the first time an empire chose military enforcement over economic reform and paid the price in insolvency. The Ottoman Empire borrowed from European creditors to fund wars it believed would preserve its financial prestige. When the cash ran out, the wars stopped, and the empire dissolved into debt settlements. The Spanish Empire extracted mountains of silver from the Americas and poured it all into military campaigns instead of productive infrastructure, watching inflation hollow out the domestic economy while the armies bled the treasury white. The lesson has always been the same. Bankruptcy is the real weapon. Insolvency is the executioner no military force in history has ever managed to defeat in the field. The final accounting of the Venezuela mistake will not be settled in 2026 or in 2030. Reserve currency transitions, when studied across history, take 15 to 20 years to fully absorb. Every year of that transition compresses purchasing power, widens the gap between wages and costs, and transfers wealth from ordinary citizens to whoever holds hard assets. This is not a temporary market correction. It is a structural reset triggered not by an enemy attack, but by a pre-dawn helicopter raid ordered from inside the most powerful government on Earth. The ledger does not care about ideology. It cares about arithmetic. And the arithmetic on January 3rd, 2026 was irreversible. Here is the lesson this ledger burns into history permanently. The dollar did not earn its position in 1973 through force. It earned it through genuine economic dominance. The United States was the world's largest manufacturer, largest creditor, and most productive economy. The dollar deserved its throne because it was built on real foundations. But over the following decades, those foundations were quietly neglected. Manufacturing hollowed out. Debt accumulated. The trade deficit widened year after year. And instead of strengthening the economic base, the system was maintained through financial pressure, sanctions, and ultimately, military intervention. Enforcement replaced excellence. Fear replaced trust. And the moment trust leaves a currency system, the system begins to die from the inside. The Venezuela invasion will be analyzed in foreign ministries, central banks, and economics departments for 100 years, not because the military operation was complex, because it was not. Not because Maduro was a sympathetic figure, because he was not. It will be analyzed because it was the moment the curtain was pulled back on the entire arrangement. The moment the petrodollar stopped pretending to be a voluntary economic system and revealed itself as a coerced one. And systems built on coercion carry an expiration date. The petrodollars ran out at 3:47 in the morning on January 3rd, 2026, in the darkness over Caracas.